Hello, today we are going to be working with soft slabs of clay to make a slump plate. So to start with, I have a big, nice, relatively flat but thick chunk of clay. And I'm going to try and make a nice large plate today. But if I don't get my clay large enough, I have a alternate smaller plate here. This is a pretty big piece to start with, so I think I'll be okay. So I'm going to need to stand up, right? The clay is really, really dense, and it can use a lot of strength to be able to roll it out. So when I stand up, you're not going to be able to see me, but you'll be able to see what I'm doing, which is the important part. So starting, of course, on a placemat, it's good to kind of pick your clay up and several times through this process. Otherwise, you're going to end up, your clay and your paper are going to kind of get married together, and it'll be a bit of a mess. If we had canvas, we wouldn't be worrying about that, but since we're using paper placemats, then we will. So I am standing up so that I can really use my weight to roll this piece of clay out. I'm going and pushing the rolling pin away from me. Adjust this just a little bit. And I already mentioned you're going to pick your clay up pretty often. It also actually makes it easier to work with. So I picked it up, I flipped it, and now I'm still rolling in the same direction because it's not as wide as I need it to be yet. And then I will flip it again, and instead of making it larger in this direction, I will start to work on making it more square than rectangular. So, you can see here, right, somewhat rectangular, so I'm going to flip it this way, right, so that I can start to make it grow and be more like a square so that it will fit my plate. So, sorry, this is shaky video because the clay is so tough, right, that makes it shaky when I roll it out. Again, picking it up, flipping it over. We don't want to make this too thick. So for me, my hands are relatively thick, so long as I keep it about the thickness of my pinky when it's laying down. If you have really tiny fingers, depending on how young you are, you might need to put like 2 fingers side by side. But most of you, if you just hold a finger next to it, you don't want it to get much thinner than that. And we don't want it so thick that it weighs a ton and uses a super lot of clay, but we don't want it so thin that it's very, very fragile and delicate and much more likely to break for what we are doing, right? And the kind of clay we are working with, it's nice to have it between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch thick. All right, we have a nice, gigantic, soft slab ready to be made into a plate. So I'm laying it down on my table. I'm going to take my plate and lay it on top. I'm going to attempt to hold this up so you can really see what I'm doing here, right? So I have the clay is bigger than the plate. That's important. It needs to be at least as big as the plate. And I am going to use the plate as my template, right, as the circle to make the plate. So now I'm just going to go and I'm going to cut around. Now my clay is going to fall into the plate a little bit, so I'm actually going to make the rim about 1/2 inch out from the edge of the plate. So I'm just using the edge of the plate as a guide. You could draw it lightly on the clay first if you wanted to with your tool, and then cut the whole way through once you are comfortable. I am cutting the whole way through, so again, I'm standing up and I'm really pressing this tool so that it is going through the clay, right, when I cut. So it has to go the whole way down to the placemat, and then when I have a big piece, I can just take it off, keep all my extra clay together, and then I will continue cutting with that extra space around the plate. So what I have now, right, is the plate and the clay, about a ½ inch wider in diameter than the plate. Now, since I'm making a slump mold, that means that the clay is kind of going to fall into the deepness of the plate here. So I'm going to center my clay and kind of let gravity work a little bit. I'm picking it up and letting it loosely fall in there, especially depending on how thin your clay is. And from here, now I'm going to start to use my thumbs, right, to really kind of press this plate into the clay. And I can kind of push in the edges as well. Really kind of make sure I'm not stretching the clay too much, right? So as I don't want it to crack and get so thin that it would break. We want it to still be the same thickness everywhere, so I'm not trying to make this part thinner. Now I'm using a Chinette plate, which is like a kind of cardboard almost, and that means it's porous and it's somewhat flexible, and my clay is not really going to stick to it. If I was using a plastic plate or a glass plate, I would need to lay something down in between. So that could be as simple as a paper towel, right, would need to go onto this plate before I would put the clay onto it. And the reason is when the clay dries, it shrinks. And if you're using something that is not porous, like styrofoam or glass or plastic, the clay is going to stick to it, and as it shrinks, it's not going to be able to slide and move, and it will actually cause it to break dramatically to the point that we wouldn't even be able to use it. So if you are using something that is styrofoam or plastic or glass, you need to put something that can move, right? Like slide and move with it. So if you were using, like I said, another surface, you would need to put the paper towel on top. I'm using the Chinette plate, which will not be a problem. All right, so now it looks like this. I'm almost finished, but I want to trim that extra clay that I have off the edges if possible. And I don't want to just curve the clay over, right? I want it, it's much too big. I'm going to hold it with my hand. And I left too much on the edge, so I'm just going to come through and cut a little more of that off, because I don't want a ton to hang over. Really, that's a personal preference. I want to be able to clean up my edges and just have it be pretty consistent the whole way around. So I'm just cutting that a little bit smaller. You can see, right, the thickness that I got off of there. Keeping all my extra clay, right, kind of compressed. And over here, if we were going to be working for a long time, we could cover that with a damp towel so it wouldn't dry out too much. All right, so now, flipping it back over. I'm going to have to do some of that work I had done again because I made it a little too big in the first place. So just getting it back into center. And now I have a pretty decent plate. You can see some of my finger marks in there. What I don't personally like right now is how unfinished this edge looks, right? And it could even get kind of sharp here after it's fired in the kiln. So I want to address that, and I'm going to use a sponge to do it. So with sponge, there's water here. I do not want to get it very wet. It might seem like it's easier if it's very wet, but you don't want to make part of your clay really, really wet and not the rest of it. And you also don't want to make it all very, very wet, because when it would start to dry, it would dry unevenly, and that causes really big cracks in the clay. And we actually want this to be a plate that we can use. So I'm just going around with my sponge first, lightly over the whole thing. And again, I wouldn't want to push it down over the edge too much because that would keep it from being able to shrink as well. And if it couldn't shrink, that would also cause it to crack, right? So I'm on a nice porous surface so it can shrink, but I also need to make sure I don't curve over the edge too much and give it something to get caught on. That would cause a problem when it is shrinking. So from now till this gets fired and bisque fired and then glazed and glaze fired, it will actually be about 13%, 10 to 13% smaller. So the clay has a lot of water in it, a lot of moisture, and once that moisture gets out of there, right, through the drying process and then really through the firing process, these particles all get closer together, and this plate will be about 10% smaller. I get a big crease in mine one of the times I was picking it up, so I'm just going to smooth that out. So, alright. So there we have it. We have a plate. There's several other things you could do with it. From this point, you could just keep it like this and then glaze it. You could put some textures into it. You could cut some pieces out with a cookie cutter or just by hand like a heart and then inlay a piece of clay on top of that. But this would be your starting point, and it could be your ending point, right? This could be what you want your plate to look like, and then you could just decorate it with glaze. So I will provide other videos with options of how I would turn it into other things. But for now, we have a nice large slumped dinner plate. This is good to go.